In the 19th century, when America was just beginning its rise to be the world's leading power, it was actually experiencing some pretty awful and now baffling things about lifestyle, education, and of course slavery and the war on the Native American population. We will tell you today about America in the 19th century. Keep watching. You're watching Flip Side of History. Tea control. It may seem unusual today, but it was the supply of tea to America that caused discontent among the settlers, which often turned into open rioting. The fact is that at that time, even before the American Civil War, the country was officially considered a British colony. Correspondingly, the British Crown imposed huge prices for tea, the price of which included a so-called tax that was used to finance local officials. Therefore, the cost of the popular drink was not affordable to everyone, and common citizens preferred to buy either a smuggled tea or tea brewed from the local plant rhododendron. But such a drink turned out to be poisonous, causing dietary poisoning. To be fair, the East Indies, which only supplied tea from Britain, was allowed to supply the drink right from China. This reduced prices immediately, and legally imported goods became cheaper than smuggled goods, which the smugglers themselves disliked. That is why the smugglers who disagreed with the British decision even openly opposed legal shipments. For instance, the so-called Boston Tea Party, where some activists simply dumped the entire cargo of tea delivered to the port overboard, is well known. Although some believe that this act had nothing to do with the smugglers, but the reaction was expressed by local citizens who opposed the British Crown's dominance. Women's rights and education. With the continuous gold rush and silver rush, more and more people came to America looking for a quick way to get wealthy. As a result, at some point, there was a catastrophic shortage of women on the mainland. Consequently, prostitutes at that time earned more than 3 times as much per month as the average worker. But the paradox of the whole situation was that decent women in America had rather limited rights. Educating in America at that time could also be described as downright horrible. First, the attitude was frankly dismissive. It was considered more important to learn a trade so that children could support themselves, and learning to read and count was categorized as a generally useless activity. And also the process of education itself was, so to speak, fascinating. There was only one class for all ages of children, so in such a room it was unrealistic to talk about cultivating any kind of skills. Moreover, pupils were taught only writing and counting. All other disciplines were reduced simply to memorizing dates and events, but nothing else. Indeed, instead of bad grades, those who failed in discipline were punished entirely with physical punishment, with sticks, belts, and even sometimes lashes. A pupil could be flogged if he or she climbed trees, cursed, played cards, deceived, or did not bow low enough to adults. But the most absurd thing was that boys and girls were punished very violently for playing together. With such an attitude, which is natural, the teaching profession was not prestigious at all. The pay for teachers was low, and as a rule, those girls who could not find any other work went into teaching. Moreover, in addition to teaching, teachers were assigned many other duties: carrying water, cleaning chimneys, carrying coal, and lighting lamps. Interestingly, under penalty of firing, teachers were forbidden from visiting swimming pools and barber shops. Slavery. Certainly, this is a very dark page in American history. Slaves had no rights whatsoever, including even the most basic chance to pray. Even converted slaves secretly hid in dugouts, leaving a man to look after the environment. This was the only way the unfortunates could make their requests to God. If hiding in dugouts or remote barracks was not possible, slaves would pray into a bucket to suppress their own voices. If a slave was spotted trying to learn to read or write, his hand was usually cut off. It was also absolutely forbidden for slaves to be able to visit one another. One of the freed slaves later recounted what was done to the offenders of this law. "We couldn't go to visit anybody, and I saw Jim Dawson tied to 4 stakes. They put him on his stomach and stretched his arms out to each side, and they tied one arm to one stake and the other to another stake. His legs were also stretched out to the sides and tied to the stakes, and then they started beating him with a wooden bar. Yeah, the kind you put in the roof." The savagery against slaves is staggering to modern men. A certain Polly Cleveland hated slaves with all her soul, beating them mercilessly for the slightest offense. She was known to beat to death a 9-month-old baby girl who irritated her with her crying. The unfortunate child was beaten with a common diaper. The demented woman beat her until the baby's mouth bled. Remarkably, after her release from slavery, the murdered girl's older sister, who was serving Cleveland's daughter, took a stone to the slave mistress' eye in revenge for her innocently murdered sister. The abuse of the slaves was terrible even before they were sold. Even during the cold, they were herded, chained 5 or 7 of them in chains, even when it was freezing. The victims were also given no shoes, so they were forced to walk barefoot in the icy ground. To keep the slaves warm, the sellers forced them to run, and when they stopped, they drove them into the stable like pigs, and then locked the doors tightly. In contrast, the masters often raped beautiful slave women, which sometimes resulted in the birth of children. However, even the fate of these babies was not enviable. From birth, they were deemed slaves. If the mistress found out that one of the slave girls had given birth to her husband, however, the slave would face a long and painful death. And finally, let's talk about what awaited a slave for assaulting a white man. If an ordinary white man did such a thing, he would simply be hanged. But even that luxury was not available to a slave. We know of an episode in which a slave killed a white woman. First, the man was tied to a horse and dragged across the city, and then he was forced to walk barefoot on steep stones after he was made barefoot. The wretched man was kept in the very sun, and, of course, nobody gave water to the accused. And when the hangman put the noose around the man's neck, death did not occur so promptly. The slave owner stripped him naked and pelted him with stones from among the crowd, threw sand in his eyes, and broke several of his ribs with a bat. Only then did the executioner pull the rope so sharply that the unfortunate person's eyes nearly fell out of their sockets. Indigenous tribes. The scheduled elimination began at the time of the so-called Great Migration, when the people who came to America settled more and more on the lands of the indigenous American peoples. And if at first the native tribes welcomed the new inhabitants friendly enough, soon there began to burst out local wars. Once anchored, the settlers began the systematic extermination of the indigenous tribes. The well-known fact of scalping, ironically enough, was unknown to the locals at all. This tradition was brought by the so-called bounty hunters, who were paid good money for one Native American killed. And to avoid dragging the body or head of the defeated enemy, the fortune chasers would present the removed scalps. At the end of the day, native tribes found themselves pushed deeper and deeper into reservations with harsh conditions of living. Finally, one of the most shameful laws against native peoples was the so-called Relocation of Natives Act, enacted in 1830. In accordance with it, the most civilized tribes, the Creeks, Seminoles, Cherokees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, were obliged to move permanently into what is present-day Oklahoma. The path the Native American people took has been recorded in history as the Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of people were forced to be relocated. The total number of those who could not bear the journey and died on the way remains unknown. And we can't leave without attention the following: the war with Britain and the Civil War. This devastation utterly changed the face of the United States, laying the basis for modern America, including its political structure, economy, psychology, and the mentality of its citizens. For the first and, by the way, only time in its history, Americans came face to face with the demand to kill each other on such an ignominious scale. The two most catastrophic disasters that occurred in America in the century before last were the War of Independence from Britain and the Civil War between the North and the South. Like every war in history, they resulted in the desolation of many areas, tremendous casualties, and not secretly widespread acts of retaliation against civilians. If the War of Independence was clear and understandable to the people, the Civil War, when the friends and brothers of years past had to fight each other, came as a real shock to the American people. Arguably, it was this war that showed that all bloody conflicts do not end the way those who started them want them to end. And in all fairness, it must be admitted that there was no mass repression of the victors against the defeated. This is something the American government of the day can be proud of, finding enough sanity to forgive. You were watching Flip Side of History channel. If you want to see more episodes on the channel, then subscribe and leave a like.